This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In late October, the Long Wharf Theatre invited scholars, artists, and community members to come together and talk about the connection between creativity and civic engagement. Today, we'll listen back to a panel discussion I hosted about the intersectionality of arts and politics for an event called Artistic Congress. It was organized by the Long Wharf Theatre in partnership with the Yale Schwarzman Center. We'll hear from Lucy Gelman, who's an editor of the arts paper and co-founder of Youth Journalism Arts Initiative at the Arts Council of Greater New Haven. We'll also hear from Leslie Badeau, who's the president of the New Haven Federation of Teachers, and also Lady Dane Figueroa Aditi, who's a performance artist, playwright, and curator of the Black Trans Women at the Center New Play Festival at the Long Wharf Theatre. I started the conversation by asking the panelists about how they think about the relationship between arts and politics. So I thought I would just kick off the conversation, getting straight to it, and ask our three panelists from their various backgrounds, what are their sort of definitions of the way art and politics intersect? And let's start with Leslie. You're in a classroom space very much. How does the role of art and politics play in your daily life?
Good morning. Thank you, Catherine. I think similar to the discussion that some people make the claim all art is political, I would also make the claim that all teaching is political. So I think that intersection is key. And specifically this year and really any year, if you're talking about public school funding, a political conversation, because our elected officials decide how funding is allocated to schools. We are often talking in certain parts of the state and country that there's not enough funding for schools. And as a union representative and a teacher and a parent of a public school student, I'm very aware of this conversation. And we always know, sadly, what's first to go when these budget cuts hit are the quote unquote extras, which we know is the art, the music, the drama, the dance, which proves that art is political because politicians are making decisions that impact our schools that ultimately are taking arts away from children. So it would be an interesting reframe to say, the core experiences of young children, of all human beings, should absolutely require and prioritize the arts in order to make sure we're meeting the needs of the whole child and creating human-centered spaces where people want to be and where people can leave really with a full range of experiences, not just literacy and math. I'll pass it back to you, and looking forward to continuing it.
Well, it's so interesting that you connected it to not just literacy and math, because on Where We Live, we actually recently just had a conversation about adult literacy and media literacy and how that is all connected, and the umbrella of literacy is not just reading and comprehension, as I think was a little bit more simplistic way of seeing that, and obviously very much connected to what we're talking about today. And Lucy, I'm so curious to hear your perspective too, because you're in the arts reporting, arts journalism space. Talk about that relationship between art and politics.
Sure. I think like all teaching is political, all art is political or has the potential to be political. And when I say that, I also think, I've been thinking recently about how in some ways that's sad to me, because the things that are political in this country should not specifically have to be political, right? Not being for the mass genocide of people shouldn't specifically be political. Believing folks are human shouldn't specifically be political. Believing that trans bodies shouldn't be policed, that Black people shouldn't be policed, shouldn't be political. But it is, right, in this country. And so I think about the intersection of arts journalism and also storytelling within that. We're in a theater space with theater makers today. So the power of storytelling, I think, is a very political and can be a radical act, because we are teaching other people about any number or any constellation of issues. And Jacob Padron, the artistic director of Long Wharf Theatre, says this: we step into a room of strangers, we listen to a story, and we emerge as completely different people. I think when I write a story about Bomba, when I write about trans women at the center, you are opening the opportunity for a dialogue with other people who hopefully already are standing in a space of understanding, but may not be.
Lady Dane, how do you follow up with that?
You know, historically, within indigenous cultures, those who we would call trans or gender expansive people were often seen as spiritual beings, right? And they often held positions of shamans and or griots and or priests, or whatever that particular culture's name has for a holy person. And the attempt to separate indigenous peoples from indigenous wisdom, so those particular trans and gender expansive people were particularly targeted. First, not only whether or not they were visually trans or gender expansive or not, but because white supremacy, colonization, after years and years and years of practice, understood that when you actually take someone's narrative from them and you say the only way you can think about yourself is the way I tell you to think about yourself, you can do generations of harm, right? And so I think, as a Black woman, as an indigenous woman, as a trans woman, as a Latina woman, that sometimes when we're having interpersonal conversations within our community around anti-Blackness, around the ways that colonization has impacted us, I know that is because white supremacy has told some people who I know personally, right, that they can only see themselves through the white gaze, G-A-Z-E. And so when we talk about art being political, art is political not just because not just because it is political in the ways that we know it to be. It is also political because the people who are making the art are political.
Building on that, really, with the revolution in mind, I think it's a constant thing that we're seeing. But I think it's fairly recent that we're more collectively comfortable in having these conversations. And even when I say that as a journalist, I'm still only seeing that in pockets of spaces. So oftentimes, what you're saying, of course, there are people out there who disagree, but that leads to our next question that I want to dig into, which you really amazingly opened up for us, is looking into the past. It's an important step to take, right? When you're trying to move into the future, but what can we learn from the past? There's so much that we can learn from the past. And now we are a little bit more comfortable in really digesting and pulling the layers back. Can you guys talk about the importance of historical context?
Yeah, how to have historical context. I'm a social studies teacher, so this is something that I think about deeply. First I just want to thank Lady Dane because we in education have so much to learn from Black trans women. What you said about honoring people's stories and the role that storytelling plays, and classrooms will be more welcoming, safe, student-centered, engaging spaces when we as educators honor the stories, honor the identities, and honor the lived experiences of all of our students. So we look to you, we thank you, we have so much to continue to learn from you. When it comes to historical context, I think of two specific examples that I have used in my class. I was really lucky to teach an elective, an international issues elective. So I really was able to follow the lead of the students. These were seniors in a law and politics pathway who were so excited to learn about current events. But again, you always have to situate the current events in some historical context. And since we're talking about art, I'll share two artists whose work I used in class, because we were wrestling with themes of climate justice in the class. What's going to motivate students to come to class and do the work is when they are allowed to think about the real problems that they know are waiting for them when they leave when the bell rings. The climate crisis is the most compelling problem. Well, I won't say most, is one of the top compelling problems that our young people know is something that is awaiting them in the immediate moment, short-term and long-term moments. So I was really trying to create a class where students could engage with issues related to climate justice. And when we peel back the layers of climate justice, we know that the solutions to the climate crisis are rooted in indigenous thinking. That we know that colonialism, if there was never colonialism, would there be a climate crisis? And one of my students raised that question one day, and it was this beautiful moment. But the historical context piece, I was able to use Emory Douglas's posters. He was the artist for the Black Panthers. I was able to use Emory Douglas posters in the class. And it's this idea that, yes, these were made in the 60s and 70s, these posters. And they might as well have been made today. For example, one of them, I was looking at a few this morning because I wanted to make sure I talked about Emory Douglas. One of them was 1970. It was called The Pentagon. And there's, a drawing of the Pentagon. There's, imagery coming out of the Pentagon. And there's a list of places on this poster. New Haven, Kent, Ohio, Laos, Palestine. 1970. New Haven and Palestine, listed on this poster from Black Panther artist Emory Douglas. So we could be talking about the 2020s. We could be talking about the 1970s. So I think, it's too cliche to say history repeats itself, so I'm not going to say it. And students want to talk about today, and then as we're able to give them the tools to see the cause and effect, more than the history repeats itself, to really dig in and with critical tools to understand cause and effect, and use Black art in the process, is a way to make our classrooms engaging, give students the historical thinking tools, or give them opportunities to sharpen those historical thinking tools, and continue to pull the thread through the present and the future, is one way that we've done it, and there's so many ways by so many teachers who know that the best way to have the tools that you need to critique the present is to dig into what we've seen, and not just the problems. I'll end here. A history class or a social studies class cannot just be a place where we hand-wring about the racism and the imperialism and the sexism. We must, as educators, always give examples to our students of people who are resisting, of people who are excelling, in contrast to the oppressive systems that we know exist. Because it can't just be the downer class of the world is against you and you're screwed, kid. It has to be stories of uplift, resistance, and excellence, because that's how we've gotten here, that we're able to be on this panel talking about this, is because of the resistors who have gotten us all here, and we're lucky to have benefited from their work.
And Lucy, I'm so curious to hear from you too, because as a
Sure.
journalist in our space, it's been very fascinating figuring out how to tell certain stories with a more humanizing angle, and the best way to do it is actually through art, and art in its various forms, but also with the idea of needing to bring in that context and all of the nuances, and what can you do in this space of 500, 700 words, or in our example, a 49-minute show. What are your thoughts about the importance of having those nuances as you're storytelling in this space?
Oh, history is everything. I think history is everything. And by that, I mean both knowing your history. And so for me, it's often local history as someone who is rooted in New Haven, but also, of course, national and global history, but also interrogating the dominant narratives that we've been fed, right? Which I think Leslie was talking about doing in the classroom. So one of the questions, I lead a journalism program for high school kids, and one of the first questions we ask them is, where are you getting your news? And overwhelmingly, the answer is TikTok or not at all. And so we start talking about local history. And one of the things I ask, and this is, to great credit to one of Leslie's colleagues, Natalia Berginski, who was a teacher at Metro Business Academy for a long time, there is such rich Black and Latino New Haven history that kids don't know about. And so I say, hey, do you know what the Panthers were doing in the late 60s and the early 70s in New Haven? Do you know about the Hill Parents Association? Do you know why Casa Boricua was founded at Yale when it was founded? And usually the answer is no. Occasionally kids are like, oh, we had a Black Panthers chapter in New Haven? Wow. And so I think for me, writing about that in my articles, like making sure that I have that history in my articles. Right now I'm writing about the leadership transition at Citywide Youth Coalition, which has existed in New Haven since the 1970s. So situating that history within what else was happening in the city? Why did we need this group in the 70s when it was founded? And then also thinking about the long history of things, right? So in New Haven, we are blessed to have multiple bomba groups in the city. And every time we write about bomba, we say, here's also the history behind it. And it's a history of resistance. And we need to talk about colonialism, we need to talk about enslavement, we need to talk about folks who thought that they could own people as property. All of that goes into the article. And yes, it's a challenge to do it and be like, and I have 1,200 words to do it, or and I have 49 minutes to do it. But I think it is well worth it to say, I have 2 sentences or 4 sentences of real estate that can be taken up by me saying this, because someone's going to read it and be turned off, and that's fine. That's not my problem. But someone's going to read it and find something out that sparks, that turns on a switch in their brain, and they're going to find out more. And I see that as a responsibility of arts reporters, especially because it's becoming very endangered.
That was Lucy Gelman, editor of the Arts Paper and co-founder of Youth Journalism Arts Initiative at the Arts Council of Greater New Haven. She was part of a panel discussion I hosted at the Long Wharf Theatre's Artistic Congress. Coming up, we continue our conversation on how art impacts politics and how politics impacts art. You can find a link to the event on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're listening back to a panel discussion I hosted in October at the Long Wharf Theatre's Artistic Congress. I was joined by Lucy Gelman, who's an editor of the Arts Paper and co-founder of the Youth Journalism Arts Initiative at the Arts Council of Greater New Haven, and Leslie Blateau, who's the president of the New Haven Federation of Teachers, and Lady Dane Figueroa Aditi, who's a performance artist, playwright, and curator of the Black Trans Women at the Center New Play Festival at the Long Wharf Theatre. In the days ahead of this event, President Joe Biden issued a formal apology for the government's role in running boarding schools, where thousands of Native American children endured abuse and forced family separation. I asked Lady Dane Figueroa Aditi to respond to the recent news and how it could impact us locally.
Well, in talking about local history, national history, and speaking of current events and in real time, just on Friday, President Joe Biden apologized to Indigenous people for the systemic abuse of Indigenous children who have had to endure forced boarding school by the federal government. And it was reported that this is the first time that a sitting president has ever done that. So from that, looking at the lens from a national perspective, which I think is how many of us consume news, how would you relate that to where we live, actually? Because that certainly will have an impact. What do we do next? Lady Dane, want to go first?
Oh, Lord, I had to go first with this one. I think, Lord, it's like not an easy answer, right?
It's not an easy question either,
yeah,
recognizing that, yeah.
It's, I mean, what I would say about it, right, is that the national and the local, right, are always in this dance, right? And I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I'll just talk about it because I think it is in current events, right? There are a lot of conversations in which, quite frankly, conservatives specifically will say, like, leave it to the states, right? But we understand historically, right, that like sometimes the states cannot be trusted to care for humans, care for the humans who are living in them. And so the federal government's job, I see the federal government's job, and just looking at history, as actually being the one who is supposed to go into the states and say, no, you cannot violate this particular person's human rights. How do we combine the local and the national? All of those things are impacting us all the time, and we are who we are all the time. And so it is impossible for me, if I am a person who is pro-voting or pro-engaging in electoral politics, to not also mention to people, and I think this is actually a failing of the pro-vote folks, is that sometimes they do not talk enough about local elections. They do not talk about how the local, listen, conservatives, whether or not they hold any position in the federal government or not, has since Reconstruction, right, have attempted to try to create silos within the country that are anti-humans, are anti-humanity. This is why we have multiple anti-trans laws coming out of multiple different states, and not everyone can just pick up and move to New York. Not everyone can just pick up and move to DC.
And I wanted to ask both of you too, with that in mind and mentioning voting, because voting is also an expression. It's a different kind of art form that I think many of us may or may not have taken for granted, that we can just go out and vote, versus there are many people who can't do that, both within our own country and beyond. So I think with that in mind, Leslie, can you talk about voting as an expression and a freedom of expression that we have now, but for many that doesn't exist?
Absolutely, and I think I'll connect it to your example that you shared about the public apology from President Biden. We know that there's a full range of ways to engage politically. One of them is voting. It's crucially important. It is not the end all be all. It cannot be the end all be all. And many of us know what we're planning to do or have already done in this election, and we know that there's still so much work to do. Even if the person who we're voting for, quote unquote, wins, there will still be so much work to do. And we have to see that incremental progress, while it's not what we're striving for, is still delivering some good here. So let's talk about President Biden. Let's talk about that he appointed Deb Haaland Secretary of the Interior. Because if the dominant narrative used to be that white colonizers are in charge of the land to ultimately extract precious materials from it to profit, that's the dominant narrative. So typically it has been white men who have been Department of Interior secretaries. And now the shift under President Biden is that we have Deb Haaland, a Native American woman whose job it is to steward and protect the land. That's a narrative shift and a real life shift that emerged only because of the electoral process. And again, I'm not saying that that we should only be operating with the electoral process. We know that significant change that impacts people's lives comes from direct action, comes from people being on the streets, comes from the protest movement. We know that. And we still have to vote. And I think, teaching is so much about tools in the toolkit. We want to make sure students have as many tools in their toolkit so they can make sense of the world around them, and not always relying on someone to tell them what to think. So they need tools to make sense of the world around them, and they need tools to know, how do you impact this world around you that everyone knows, our youth especially know how crucially important it is to change the world around us. So yes, President Biden can apologize for the U.S. government's abuse and murder of indigenous children in residential homes, and we still have a crisis where more youth than any other country are locked up in this country, still, primarily Black and brown youth. And we still have work to do in our school systems to make sure that we are pulling our children close and not sending them away, so ultimately the school to prison pipeline is perpetuated. We really need to think of what is the purpose of public school. And if the purpose of public school can and must be to build a community of folks who will be able to tackle the problems that we all are facing. I was lucky enough to sit into a seminar with Jennifer Berkshire, who's a journalist and podcaster, and she came and visited a class at Wilbur-Cross. She just wrote a book, The Education Wars. She came and visited a class at Wilbur-Cross and discussed some of the book with with students at Wilbur-Cross High School. And she shared with them her ideas about the purpose of public school. And it's more aspirational, even with its flaws. Public school has done more for income inequality in this country than much else. And then she describes the fact that she teaches in a prison. With a program associated with Boston University, or Boston College, I think. And she said when she asked her students in prison what they thought the purpose of public school was, their answers were very different than what she believes and what she had conversations with other people. Their answers were, purpose of public school was make sure we ended up here. And the students in the room in Wilbur-Cross were riveted because I think they can see both answers as very much being true and real. That yes, purpose of public school is to make sure that everyone, because remember, it's universally accessible, public school. So the purpose of public school is to make sure everyone has the tools they need to do this work of that we are all trying to do in this democratic country, little d, in this country that is a democracy, right? And the purpose of public school is to sort and rank and exclude. And ultimately that leads to the prison piece that I wanted to highlight. So yeah, we'll take the apology, and it requires so much more work, because if harmful systems, if carceral systems are still impacting our youth, then we're not done yet. And we've got more work to do.
Well, and clearly this conversation is ongoing, and Lucy, I wanna ask you this too, where the idea of arts and politics, it's not a new concept. Humans have been doing it, I think, since the dawn of time, that we have knowledge and we know how to use this knowledge. So can you talk about that kind of historical context in terms of the relationship between arts and politics? Do you think it's changed? Are we kind of doing the same things? Are we expressing more? How has that evolved, you say?
Well, that's a good question. I think in some ways it has changed. So I'm thinking specifically of social media right now, and I think social media is really a double-edged sword. Sometimes I hate it because I have to do the social media for our organization, and it makes me crazy. But I also think citizen journalism is not an inherent bad. So there are a lot of people who want, and I promise this does sort of answer, I hope. There are a lot of people, I think, who want to say, I've been through this training, I've been appointed to be a journalist, I can share knowledge. And I think that knowledge should be shared democratically as early and often as possible. And so in that way, the fact that people have phones, right? The way people are recording things, from traffic stops to what's happening in Gaza, to what's happening in different places in this country, to the way we record marches, right? I've called on other people and said, hey, I was reporting on a March for Black Lives Matter, and I saw that you also had this footage, and I'm interested in linking to it in my article, things like that. I think that has been a huge change. But I also think, and I was thinking about this when Leslie was speaking, and also when Lady Jane was speaking, when people sort of throw their hands up and say, we're powerless and we can't do anything, and we have to vote for the lesser of two evils, and I'm just done with this, a word I can't use for the FCC, it really annoys me, right? It makes me really angry, because I think, yes, exercise your vote at the ballot box. I am pro-voting, but also the idea that people are powerless, and I think, we've had that interplay throughout history. I think about, when you said, well, why did people come over here? I was thinking about feudalism and the birth of capitalism, and of course it's not unique to Europe. There's also the caste system and all of that. You have these histories of people rising up and saying, we're not going to take this anymore. And I think, again, teaching, like making sure we teach that history, that folks know that art can be a revolutionary act, and that they can rise up and resist the dominant narrative, and then also, bring their voice to the ballot box and enact change in their own communities. So I think in ways, yes, it's changed because our world is changing and the problems around us are changing. But I also think, in some ways, I take solace in the fact that the world is literally on fire. It's a really scary place to exist right now. And when you look at history, you're like, oh, okay, artists have been working through this in other scary times. And I take comfort in that.
I really like that philosophy because we've been talking about art as a form of protest. And you just mentioned art itself is revolutionary and how universal it is. It's interesting to see if you pick any point of history, there are artists who are actually creating the thing that brings comfort, or they're creating the thing that is protesting. I recently spoke with two young Afghan musicians. They're in their 20s, and they were fortunate enough to be able to escape a Taliban-led government 2 years ago. And one of them is a pianist, the other person is a cellist, and they both spoke fervently of how they turned to music for comfort and to preserve their cultural history and as a form of resistance. And it's amazing to hear that they're 20 years old, and I cannot imagine the life that they have led up until this moment. But with that in mind, art is also a form of healing for them because they both turn to their instruments when life is chaotic. And I think many of us have the equivalent. We turn to something when things are getting a little rough. So can you talk about art, whether you're consuming it or expressing it, that it can be healing for all of us?
Yeah, I think I was mentioning that in our meeting yesterday about how so I co-direct an organization called the Black Trans Prayer Book, and we utilize art as a healing tool for trans folks. And other folks who are in our community have also come to our workshops. And for me, I think about the civil rights movement and how sometimes, the songs that were sung at the gatherings were certainly used as a rallying cry or a sword, but then sometimes they were also used as a healing balm. The reason why, along with trans people, schools, journalists, right, that artists and art institutions have been historically targeted when said art institutions are working against a dominant narrative, a white supremacist narrative, a colonist agenda. The reason why then they're often targeted politically is because within a capitalist, consumerist, white supremacist culture, the idea is that everything must work for it. So art must become propaganda versus healing tool, versus visioning tool, versus protest tool. Okay, I'm gonna share one more story. Dr. King and Nichelle Nichols. You probably have already heard this story if you know anything about. I'm a huge nerd, sexy nerd.
I think we're all nerds in this space. You're in the right place.
And Nichelle Nichols was gonna leave Star Trek, and she was at a hotel. And they said, oh, your biggest fan wants to see you, right? And she said, what? Okay, tell them to come over. And it was Dr. Martin Luther King, y'all. And he had said to her, and she shared this story countless times, right? And he said to her, she was like, oh, I'm gonna leave because I wanna do Broadway and and he said, no, you have to stay on that show. And she said, why? She didn't say it like that. And his response to her was like, because you being on that show proves that we survived. You being on that show proves that we're in the future. Y'all, I cannot tell you, in this moment that we're living in this country, conservatives are actually, when they started with trying to say it's about bathrooms. And trans people said it is not about bathrooms. I am in DC, and I remember being at the White House and saying, all of us, Black and brown trans women, saying, you have to deal with white supremacy because it is here and it is trying to take all of us out. But the Obama administration wanted to set up the country for a Hillary presidency. And they believed that if he shook the table too much as a Black man, as the first Black president, it could mean disaster and that the Democrats would not win the next presidential election. And Black and brown trans women in DC were saying, you have to understand it is trying to kill us. How are you using your power? And who are you responsible to? And what I'm telling you is that you need to be responsible to girls like me, to women like me.
That was Lady Dane Figueroa Adidi. She was part of a panel discussion at the Long Wharf Theatre's Artistic Congress in New Haven. The theme of the weekend was using art to build bridges, connection, and inspire positive change in civic spaces. Coming up, we talk about the impact of representation in arts and media. From Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're listening back to a panel discussion that took place at the Long Wharf Theatre's Artistic Congress in October. I was joined by Lucy Gelman, who's an editor of the arts paper and co-founder of Youth Journalism Arts Initiative at the Arts Council of Greater New Haven, Leslie Plateau, who's the president of the New Haven Federation of Teachers, and Lady Dane Figueroa Adidi, who's a performance artist, playwright, and curator of the Black Trans Women at the Center New Play Festival at the Long Wharf Theatre. In arts, media, and politics, the faces we see matter, and it makes an impact. I asked our panelists how they think about representation in the arts. As you were speaking, all I can think about was, this is very difficult to condense all of that into one word, but representation came to mind because the examples you used really resonated with a young Catherine growing up. The only Asian face I saw on the screen was from Power Rangers. That's dating myself here, but some of you may remember there's one Asian Power Ranger. And I didn't realize what impact that would have on me actually as an adult. I don't think it really hit me as a kid. I just thought they were all cool and all these cool friends and have superpowers and they just look awesome. And I wanted to emulate them and I tried really hard. But my mom didn't let me go into gymnastics, which to this day I still hold her accountable for. But it's really as an adult, and actually the last couple of years I had that revelation of realization of how much that has been forcibly hidden to me. I didn't have access to that growing up here as a young, Asian girl. And so as you were speaking about your own experiences, the turmoil, the pain, the power of art that can be a resisting form and also as a healing form, I'm sure that idea can resonate with so many people listening, both here and beyond. So I'm curious to hear too, from both Lucy and Leslie with the representation in mind. And Leslie, maybe we'll start with you because you mentioned posters earlier. And that also made me think, posters are art forms that you can take to the streets. Anybody can see it. And it can evoke all kinds of feelings. How can that impact a person, whether you're older or younger? How can that impact a person actually, whether it's to vote or to create or to protect or to support? How can that have an impact?
I think teachers have a responsibility when we're planning our units of study, our lessons, when we're selecting our sources. The reality is, 2020s, there's no lack of sources and information. We are officially on information overload, so it makes the selection process for educators even more challenging because we have so many things to choose from. So how do we select the sources that we're going to use to do a lot of things? How are we going to select sources to teach the content we need to teach the skills that we need to teach, and equally important, build the community in the room so that students see themselves in the work. And I think when teachers choose to use posters, graphic images, photographs, when we choose to do that, we are choosing to welcome all of our students into the work at the outset, because regardless of languages spoken, regardless of ability or disability, in some cases, not all, regardless of whether a student had missed class for a week because they're unhoused, you open class with a photograph, and invite all of your students to look at the photograph and do the work. It does have a universalizing effect and a welcoming effect that you can then build off of. And I think, we have to choose, especially I'm a white woman. So as a white woman who is a teacher of primarily Black and brown kids, I have to choose sources that decenter whiteness. And I'm gonna rephrase. I have to choose sources where the voices, stories, and imagery of people with lived experiences that mirror my students' experiences are there in the classroom. We have to. It's not a squeeze it in later in February nonsense. It's a have to every week of class. And if I can go back to the art as healing, I think art. I'm so grateful for how you shared so much with us about the role, and I love the expression of art as balm. I think art is also so crucial because it shows us not just the problems, but it shows us how people are making sense of the problems, which is crucial given the current mental health crisis that we know so many youth are experiencing, and just so much, we're just in a collective state of PTSD, given what we see on our phones, in the news. So I'm gonna bring it back to where I wanted to go, which is when we can see examples of people making sense of the nightmarish things that we experience through art, it, one, gives us tools to critique and make sense of really hard things, and then two, it helps us to heal collectively. For example, this course that I taught, where I used Black art to help students make sense of the climate crisis, I used the photographs of LaToya Ruby Frazier, an incredible photojournalist who did a series of portraits called Flint is Family. So we all know the nightmare of the Flint water crisis. And how do you make sense of that? How do you make sense that in the richest country in the history of the world, we couldn't fix the water system for the families in Flint? This used to be a city where public education was fully funded because we actually taxed corporations at real rates, and we taxed the car companies, and we had fully funded public schools. My father-in-law went to Flint High School, in the 50s. He said it was amazing. He said the timpani drums that we had, the amazing woodwind instruments, everyone was in orchestra and symphony at your public school in Flint. Fast forward, right, to where the Reagan era destroyed the tax infrastructure that we should be relying on to fund our public schools, and you've got children and families being poisoned by lead water. And then we have LaToya Ruby Frazier, who through her photographs helps us make sense of the families who were impacted, of the resilience and the beauty of families in Flint who are navigating what is truly so impossible to comprehend. But yet we can go back to those tangible photographs that her brilliance delivered to us, and share those with our students, and then they can learn about Flint, they can learn about what needs to be done about it, they can learn about the organizing on the ground to fix it, and they can learn that being a photojournalist, being a photographer is a job. And they can learn that working in a museum is a job. It's not all, we don't always have to just think about the career readiness stuff. And students do need to have real examples of things beyond, a pediatrician, a police, or professional sports. Sometimes that's all our kids kind of are thinking for jobs. I'm a lawyer, right? But there's so many. So if we can really, use art to show the world is full of messed up things, we can make sense of them through art. We can come together in space together and build community with art. And again, we're saturated with screens, we're saturated with crises. More and more of the members that I represent want to just get back to student-centered, human-centered spaces where we play theater games, where we write with pencil and paper, where we have conversations with each other, where we're not tested on laptops every month for the data trackers. Look into what's going on in public schools, right? How are our teachers doing? Why are they stressed? I know I just hijacked the conversation to do an advocacy plug for teachers, but I think it does come back to art is healing, and if we prioritize arts in our spaces, our students will be much more available for the full range of learning that the policymakers want us all to be prioritizing. So
I just want to lift up two points that really resonated with me. And the first, and this is such a duh, but of course representation matters, but it also matters for all people, right? Including white people. Because white supremacy hurts all people, including white people. So as a reporter, one of the things that's closest to my heart is education and arts reporting. I spend a lot of time in the classroom of someone named Nikki Claxton, who's at Betsy Ross Arts Magnet School. And she is, she's a Black woman. She's been dancing since she was in diapers. She's an incredible, incredible educator. And every time, without fail, every time I see kids walk into her class, it's transformative because they are seeing a lot of our educators in the New Haven public school system. So despite the fact that 75% of our student body is students of color, especially Black and Latino students, we have a problem with overwhelmingly white educators. And when they walk in and they see someone who looks like their mom, who looks like their aunts, who looks like their big sisters, it is transformative for them. And Lady Dane, you said earlier, the art saved your life. I know kids where they would not be here if they had not been through Miss Nikki's classroom. And I think about that a lot. And the other thing that you said that I so appreciate is if you are in an institution, an arts institution, and you have access to resources, use that power. So one thing I think about all the time is a conversation I heard between Maddie Syatt and Ty Defoe, who are both Indigenous theater makers. And they were talking about the importance of joy and how at institutions, especially that have historically and sometimes are still run by white people, there is a premium placed on trauma. So if you are a theater maker, a dancer, a visual artist of color, you might be offered $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to make a work about your trauma. And we've seen this happen with people in the New Haven community. But if you just want to write a beautiful coming of age piece where kids sit in the grass and they look up at clouds, good luck. Good luck. And this is a literal example. I remember Maddie Syatt saying, I just want to write about clouds. So I would also say, if you have access to power, use, fund people to write about clouds if they want to write about clouds, because that joy is radical. And we should not just be telling stories where people of color are experiencing trauma. There has been enough trauma in this country.
You just heard a panel discussion from the Long Wharf Theatre's Artistic Congress. You can find more about the event on our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Our producers are Tess Terrible and Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app, and thank you so much for listening.